Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 200, January 6th to January 12th, 1864. Last week, we took a tour of world events in 1865. Much as we have done in previous years, I think it's important to take a look at the events that are happening abroad so that we have a context for just history during this time period in general. This week we'll talk a little about the opening of peace negotiations with the Confederacy and also read some first-hand accounts of soldiers' life. Let's open, though, with Francis Preston Blair Sr. Before we do that, we need to talk about our Patreon content, and of course we have a new episode that's coming up here. We will be doing a movie review, and we're going back to the well of classics here, shall we say, and we're going to do Gone with the Wind. I know it's been a long time coming. It's been a little bit since the Atlanta campaign, and I think it's also probably decent as we conclude the war and then get into Reconstruction as well. So we'll talk about Gone with the Wind, review that movie. We've done other movies in the past. We've done memoir reviews. We talked about battlefield monuments here to close out 2024. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. Now, we have talked about Francis Preston Blair Jr. as far back as the Camp Ferguson days, but now we must mention Sr., and not just because, if you've ever been to Silver Spring, Maryland, that name comes from his estate. Blair was a politician who had supported Andrew Jackson back in the day, and Little Hickory, James Polk. He had turned a Free Soiler and then helped to found the Republican Party. He would back Fremont and then Lincoln as party candidates. During the war, he would serve as an advisor for the president. Frank, of course, was a general, having served in many of the campaigns we have discussed, currently still with Sherman's army. And we also have Montgomery Blair, his other son, serving in the cabinet. Blair had been born in Abington, Virginia, and still had some Southern connections. In 1865, he would request the opportunity to negotiate with Jefferson Davis. He would write, "Sir, I have deemed it proper and probably desirable to you to give you in this form the substance of remarks made by me to be repeated by you to President Lincoln, and I have no disposition to find obstacles in forms, and am willing now, as heretofore, to enter into negotiations for the restoration of peace, and ready to send a commission whenever I have reason to suppose it will be received, or to receive a commission if the U.S. government shall choose to send none. That, notwithstanding the rejection of our former offers, I would, if you could promise that a commissioner, minister, or other agent would be received, appoint one immediately, and renew the effort to enter into conference with a view to secure peace to the two countries." Lincoln would respond, "Sir, you have shown me Mr. Davis's letter to you of the 12th instant. You may say to him that I have constantly been, and am now, and shall continue ready to receive any agent whom he or other influential person, now resisting the national authority, may informally send to me with the view of securing peace to the people of our common country. Yours, A. Lincoln." Now, what exactly was all that about? It brings us to an interesting point. Why had there been so little in terms of peace negotiation before? Well, the answer is fairly simple. Neither side is really willing to budge. The whole goal of the Confederacy is to get the Union to the negotiation table, albeit a position where they have the upper hand, which is why foreign intervention is seemingly something that they are very much desired for in the beginning of the war. The Southern states wanted to be recognized as a legitimate nation, something Lincoln and the North are not going to do. For the North, reunited the Union is going to be the main goal, so if you are trying to do that, negotiation would seem counterproductive. In fact, the decision was already made that there would be no peaceful conclusions to the war as far back as 1862. So it makes sense that there has not been any to this point, and especially if the North will not entertain anything less than the United States and a recognizing of emancipation. We will cover exactly what those negotiations look like at the Hampton Roads Peace Conference in a future episode. Now, this is not to say that the Confederate States have not attempted to maybe come to the negotiation table before. Famously, they want to have a conference prior to Gettysburg, prior to the outcome of Gettysburg, I should say. They are seemingly operating in a position of strength, as we mentioned. That's really what their main goal is with any kind of negotiation. So, having just defeated Hooker at Chancellorsville, having moved into the northern states, and a better situation, I should say, than Antietam, where they're kind of operating there for a longer period of time, that would seemingly be a good time to say, hey, we could end all of this right now. Certainly, Gettysburg goes a little bit differently. I personally don't think, in my opinion, it's just me, that the war would end necessarily if that had happened, but there might have been some sort of negotiation at that point. I think, though, that the goals are too far set for most in the North, for certainly the Lincoln administration. They need the country to be reunited. That is goal number one. So if that is really the primary objective, and you have these secondary objectives that are kind of popping up because of that, then there's really not a whole lot of room to negotiate. Negotiation in general would also be seemingly implying that the Confederate States are not just in rebellion, that they are their own entity. You know, you mentioned in that note that we see, there is some verbiage that's like between our two countries, and that's obviously not going to go over well for Lincoln either. You know, we're not two separate countries, we're the same country. You guys just need to come back into the fold. And we'll see how the Hampton Roads Peace Conference happens in a future episode, as mentioned, and it actually might be surprising to you exactly how that goes down. So, I want to continue today with some first-hand accounts of soldier life, especially as we are in winter quarters, shall we say. There's not a whole lot going on right now in terms of events, but it's a good time to just kind of look and see exactly how these soldiers are living. We've done this in the past, but wanted to just crank out a few more. Always important, in my opinion, to read through some first-hand accounts and see exactly how the ordinary soldier lives. This first account is actually going to be from a private in the Texas Brigade, the famous Texas Brigade, and he's going to describe the construction of a soldier's doghouse. We at once began to make ourselves as comfortable as possible, each company dividing up into messes. These messes are usually composed of from 4 to 6 men. We began at once to erect our little doghouses. Now, as I have promised to tell my young readers about the doghouse, I guess I had as well to do so here. We select a tree about 10 or 12 inches in diameter, being careful to get one with a long straight body, and that has the appearance of splitting well. We cut it up into cuts 7 or 10 feet long, according to the size of the doghouse we want, which is governed by the number of men in the mess. We split the cuts up into slabs about 8 inches thick. Then we begin somewhat as you would to build a pig pen, building up one end and the two sides, leaving the south end open. We build up about 3 feet high. Then we set up a fork or post at the center of each end, and cut a pole across for a ridgepole, or comb of the structure, and over this place a covering of anything we can get, usually an old piece of tent cloth, drawing it tightly down to the legs or slabs on each side as tight as we can and making it fast. We then close up the opening at the north end and close all the cracks, making it wind tight. We then rake up dry leaves and fill the doghouse about 10 inches deep with the leaves, which makes us a good warm bed. On these leaves we spread one blanket and use the remainder of our blankets for covering. Our fire is built at the open end, the reflection of the heat from the fire striking the top of the covering of this doghouse obliquely is thrown by reflection down upon our bedding, making it quite warm and comfortable. We keep our fires in cold weather all day, and pretty well all night. So we have this doghouse construction. It's a pretty decent description of it, and certainly mentioned colder weather. This would have been a more permanent structure. Obviously, the soldiers are really eager always to get into their winter quarters so they can build something like this. Obviously, it takes a long time. You can make it very comfortable, but then if you have to move, obviously you're going to be upset about that, right? So that's why there's a lot of griping in terms of the marching. The Mud March was a famous example where there were a lot of Union soldiers who were like, man, we had to leave our winter quarters and then we got back and there were other people living in them. So you have this very negative view. Once you've built the structure, you want to make sure that you remain in it. And you would probably improve upon it as well. There's other examples of individuals who build more permanent structures even during the winter months. Here we have an Illinois soldier talking about Army life. I promised Mother I would tell you about how our fort is made. It is 40 feet square, one side being a triangle. There are 5 corners to it in each corner, and there is a small roundhouse 15 feet across. The captain and lieutenant stay in one of these houses, while the men are divided into 4 messes, 23 men in a mess. Each mess stays in one of these houses. The fort is all made of round timber, set on one end, some 10 feet high, with portholes for us to shoot through. There's a door to each house, and one to the fort. A tent is placed on top of each house to cover it. The ground is our floor. There is some straw on the floor. 2 men sleep together. Uncle Risden and I sleep together. We spread one blanket down on the straw to sleep on, and cover the other end, and sometimes we button our overcoats together and spread them over us. We use our knapsacks for pillows. Each of us has a wooden pen drove in the logs above our heads, on which we hang our guns and other things. You would want to know how we make our coffee. Well, we cook our outdoors altogether as yet. We have a small ditch or trench in the ground, the sides of which are fixed up with rock, and a little chimney for the smoke to pass through. We put water in a tin boiler, which holds about as much as our wooden bucket. But I was too fast. We make the fire first, then put on the pot, and when it boils, we put the coffee in and let it boil 5 or 10 minutes. But I expect you would laugh at our coffee mill were you to see it. George puts some coffee in a sheet iron pan, which holds about 2 gallons, sets it on the ground, takes a gun, and pounds it until it's fine enough for use. We have a broad plank fixed up for the table. We stand up to each. Each of us has a tin pan for a plate, a tin cup to drink coffee out of, also a knife, fork, and spoon. I believe I told you we have to eat in my other letter. As for the washing of some of our hire others to wash, and others wash for themselves. For my part, I do my own washing. Sew on all the buttons that come off, and so on. Take good care of that sweet little sister till I come home. I suppose her name is Elizabeth. Tell Mother to call her Elizabeth Ann. So there we have another more permanent structure. And here we have a structure selection, perhaps, that goes wrong. And this is a private from a Virginia regiment. After a weary march of 9 miles, the bivouac of the main reserve post was reached, and here we witnessed the first real rejoicing of this Christmas holiday, the joy of the men on duty to be relieved and allowed to return to camp. Our loss was their gain, and the gratitude they shouted as they gave up their places, a very necessary warning. It was couched in 3 words. Better be careful of them or lice. In explanation, it will be only necessary to state that the rush huts are shelters, made by leaning along saplings or poles against a tree, or resting them upon a traverse pole between 2 trees, and covering the poles with boughs, leaves, etc., have been occupied for months by all kinds of men, including, of course, many dirty, slovenly fellows, careless of cleanliness, and dropping vermin wherever they went, to say nothing of where they stretched their dirty blankets. Hence, these outpost bivouacs became literally swarming with the hateful insects, and even the greatest care seemed inadequate to prevent their getting a lodgment somewhere in one's clothes or blankets. And once entrenched in the seam of a garment, there is no dislodging them, as even 2 hours boiling on hot water merely makes them more vigorous and lively. To escape this plague of Egypt, I declined to take possession of any of the deserted quarters, but spent the long night wrapping in my blanket, crouched by the side of the fire in the driving storm. Indeed, throughout the entire war, after accustoming myself to coarse, dirty clothing, coarse, dirty food, and coarse, dirty companionship, I could not conquer my intense abhorrence of the pestiferous pests, the graybacks, and went upon a long march with no chance to either obtain a change of underclothing or wash those I wore. The mortification of knowing the vile vermin were in possession, and multiplying 10 times faster than they could be destroyed, was so great as to make me perfectly miserable, so much so that I could not think of anything else. So there, we've talked before about how when a lot of these soldiers come together, there is more chance for disease, more chance for vermin, and there are a lot of people talk about these lice that they will get, and how they become lousy, right? It's kind of where that term comes from, if you've ever thought about that. But they become lousy with these lice, and it's not a very pleasant experience. And it's also a good segue into also talking about how, and we've mentioned this before, how these individuals who come together from the countryside and then they're confined together in a place that is not clean, a lot of them will succumb to disease. That's why a lot of more individuals are going to die from disease than they will battlefield casualties. But we can move on here. Here's a soldier talking about food. Of provisions, Uncle Sam usually gave us a sufficiency, but the table had little variety and fewer delicacies. On first entering the service, the drawing of our rations was not a small undertaking, for there was nearly 100 of us in the company, and it took a considerable weight of bread and pork to feed a hungry 100 of stomachs. And after we had been in the field a year or two, the call "fall in" for your hardtack was leisurely responded to by only about a dozen men, lean, sinewy, hungry-looking fellows, each with a haversack in hand. They would squat around a gum blanket spread on the ground, on which was a small heap of sugar, another of coffee, another of rice, maybe, which the corporal was dealing out by successive spoonfuls. They held open their little black bags to receive their portion, while near by lay a small piece of pork or beef, or possibly a small amount of desiccated vegetables. Much depended, of course, on the cooking of the provisions furnished us. At first we tried a company cook, but we soon learned the saying of Miles Standish: if you wish a thing to be done well, you must do it yourself. If not, you must leave it to others. This applies to cooking quite as well as to courting. We therefore soon dispensed with our cook, although scarcely any of us knew how to cook as much as a cup of coffee. When we took the field, a keen appetite, aided by that necessity, which is ever the mother of invention, soon taught us how to make bean soup and hardtack, prepared hardtack. It is a question I have much debated with myself while writing this diary, whether this chapter should not be entitled Hardtack. It would seem that but little could be said of the culinary art in camp without involving some mention of hardtack at almost every turn. If you take a hardtack in your hand, you will find it somewhat heavier than an ordinary biscuit, but if you will reduce it to a fine powder, you will find that it will absorb considerably more water than an equal weight of wheat flour, showing that in making hardtack, the chief object in view was to stow away the greatest amount of nourishment in the smallest amount of space. I also observed that hardtack was very hard. This I attributed to its great age, for there was a common belief among the boys that our hardtack had been baked long before the beginning of the Christian era. This opinion was based upon the fact that the letters B.C. were stamped on many, if not, indeed, all the cracker boxes. To be sure, there were some wiseacres who shook their heads and maintained that these mysterious letters were the initials of the names of some army contractor or inspector of supplies, but the belief was widespread and deep-seated that they were without a doubt intended to set forth in an era which our bread had been baked. Our hardtack was very hard. We could scarcely break it with our teeth. Some we could scarcely fracture with our fist. Still, as I have said, there was an immense amount of nourishment stowed away in them, as we soon discovered, when once we learned the secret of getting at it. It required some experience, and no little hunger, to enable one to appreciate hardtack rightly, and it demanded no small amount of inventive genius to understand how to cook hardtack as it ought to be cooked. If I remember correctly, in our section of the army, we had 15 different ways of preparing them. In other parts, I understood they had discovered 1 or 2 ways more. But with us, 15 was the limit of the culinary art. If there was time for frying, we either dropped them into the fat in the dry state and did them brown to a turn, or soaked them in cold water and then fried them, or pounded them to a powder mixed with this boiled rice, and made griddle cakes and honey minus the honey. When, as was generally the case on the march, our hardtack was broken into small pieces in our haversacks, we soaked these in water and fried them in pork fat, stirring well and seasoning with salt and pepper, thus making what was commonly called hell-fired stew. But the great triumph of the culinary art in camp, to my mind, was hardtack pudding. This was made by placing the biscuit in a stout canvas bag and pounding the bag and contents with a club on a log until the biscuits were reduced to a fine powder. Then we added a little wheat flour, if we had it, the more the better, and made a stiff dough, which we next rolled out on a cracker box, like a pie crust, and we covered this all over with a preparation of stewed dried apples, dropping in there a raisin or two, just for old lang syne's sake. Rolled and wrapped it in a cloth, boiled it for an hour or so, and ate it with wine sauce. The wine was usually omitted, and hunger inserted in its stead. Thus we saw what truly vast and unsuspected possibilities resided in this innocent-looking 3.5-inch hardtack. 3 made a meal, 9 were a ration, and this was what fought the battles for the Union. The Army hardtack had but one rival, and that was the Army bean, a small white roundish soup bean. It was quite innocent-looking, as was its inseparable companion, the hardtack, and like it, was possessed of possibilities which the uninitiated would never suspect. It was not so plastic and edible as the hardtack, not susceptible to so wide a range of use, but the one great dish which might be made of it was so preeminently excellent that it threw hellfire stew and hardtack pudding quite into the shade. This was baked beans. No doubt bean soup is very good, as is also very common. But oh, baked beans. I had heard of the dish before, but never had remotely imagined what toothsome delights lurked in the recesses of a camp kettle of beans, baked after the orthodox, backwoods fashion, until one day Bill Hunter of Company K, whose home was in the lumber regions, where the dish had no doubt been invented, said to me, "Tomorrow morning we're going to have baked beans for breakfast. If you'll walk around to the lower end of camp, 10th Street with me, I will show you how we bake beans up in the country I come from." It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the boys were already busy. They had an enormous camp kettle about 2/3 full of parboiled beans. Nearby, they had dug a hole in the ground about 3 feet square and 2 deep, and in on top of which a great fire was to be made about dusk, so as to get the hole thoroughly heated and full of red-hot coals by the time tattoo sounded. Into this hole the camp kettle was then set, with several pounds of fat pork on top of the beans, and securely covered with an inverted mess pan. It was sunk into the red-hot coals, by which it was completely concealed, and was left there all night to bake, one of the camp guards throwing a log on the fire from time to time to keep matters going. Early the next morning, one shook me roughly as I lay sleeping soundly in my tent. "Get up, Billy. Breakfast is ready. Come to our tent. If you never ate baked beans before, you never ate anything worth eating." I found 3 or 4 of the boys seated around the camp kettle, each with a tin plate on his knee and a spoon in his hand, doing their very best to establish the truth of the old adage, "The proof of the pudding is in the eating." Now, it's far more difficult matter to describe the experience of the palate than of either the eye or the ear, and therefore I shall not attempt to tell how very good baked beans are. So there we have a very lengthy description, actually, of all the ways in which you could make hardtack, and it's actually quite amusing how this is particularly written, I believe, and it goes to show that you have a lot of ingenuity when it comes to something that is subpar in terms of eating. If that's the only thing you have to eat, you're going to come up with ways to make it better. And also, maybe some of you are fans of baked beans out there. I didn't think maybe you would get a love letter to lay baked beans in there, but there you go. We have that as well. Now, there's other aspects of camp life that we want to go over here as well before we close out for today. One of them is actually going to be practical jokes. During these days of wild soldiering, the men were addicted to playing practical jokes upon each other. Sometimes when a party be laying asleep around the campfire, with their boots out and their weak feet stretched out toward the welcome coals, a comrade would move a blazing branch closer to the glistening soles. Presently, the sleeper would move uneasily and draw up his pedal extremities. Then the branch would be moved closer. If followed by a similar movement, and this program would be followed up until the sleeper had gradually traveled over considerable ground. When at last the sleeper awakened, he would look about him with a bewildered stare, until the last of his comrades brought him to a realization of the pranks that had been played upon him. There was another mode of dealing with soldiers accustomed to sleep with their mouths open. A long train of paper would be made and laid with one end in his mouth and the other end some distance. The end furthest away would be lighted, and the paper would burn gradually up toward his face, and presently awaken him with its light and heat. On such occasions it would be a comical sight to observe the curious emotions displayed upon his face, the uncertainty for a time, and then the sudden consciousness that brought him to his feet with startling suddenness. So it definitely sounds like a wild time, right? Lighting things on fire and then putting paper in somebody's mouth. Definitely an interesting, if not, amusing for everyone watching, I suppose. But you had to pass the time some ways. And a lot of times when we talk about our memoirs and the Patreon feed, there are more of an emphasis on these events that are not combat, because these are the things that they're really going to remember. Speaking of remembering things, we actually do have an individual who is going to talk about attending a ball, and this is actually from a female perspective, a guest of the ball for some individuals in the Army of the Potomac. The all-important ball was to come off that night, and we could not sit too long at dinner. Each lady was provided with an agreeable escort, and ambulances conveyed us to headquarters of the 8th Ohio, where we disposed of our outside wraps before going to the pavilion, which had been erected for dancing, and a supper room. The dancing room, which would accommodate 25 sets at one time, was decorated with all sorts of decor and was lighted by 3,000 sprung candles and chandeliers tastefully trimmed with evergreens. Artillery, small arms, and pyramids of cannonballs were placed in different parts of the room. The supper was all that could be desired, and it is not necessary to state that the music was exceedingly fine. The dancing kept up until 4 o'clock in the morning without any Waterlooish interruptions, although we were near enough to see the flash of sunlight on the bayonets of the enemy the next morning. I've often wondered if there was not an item of information given to add interest to the occasion, and those bayonets were not handled by some of Uncle Sam's boys. However, I tell the tale as was told me. We breakfasted at 9 o'clock and were soon ready to attend a review of the 2nd Corps, which would take place at Stevensville, a place a few miles distant. 20,000 troops were reviewed by General Meade, accompanied by his staff and a number of ladies on horseback. It was a grand sight to us who knew not then that it would be our good fortune to witness one superlatively grand, and this cruel war was over, and 200,000 troops would occupy 2 days in passing through Washington on their way home. Upon our return from the review, another good dinner awaited us, after which we went to see the 4th Ohio boys on dress parade, and to visit them in their barracks. We were invited to their ball, which was served on a schoolroom and for dancing. The sides were adorned with pictorial papers. The lights hung in the center of the room and were trimmed with evergreens. From a beam which ran across the upper part of the room, a large card was suspended, on one side of which was printed in pencil Lincoln, Seward Chase, and the Union Forever. On the reverse side was Washington, Grant, Warren, Shields, and Carroll. A table and school books on it stood in one corner. After we had thoroughly inspected the building, we passed to Company H's quarters, where we found some of the boys singing. The place soon became crowded, and we were obliged to go outside, where we held an open-air concert. All joined in singing When Johnny Comes Marching Home Again, Brave Boys Are They, Rally Around the Flag, and John Brown's Body, with the impromptu verses. By this time a fire had been made in amusement hall, the ground for it had been sprinkled with sawdust, an invitation sent for us to return and spend the evening there dancing, which we were glad to do. When we arrived, we sat on the floor, made up entirely of gentlemen. Those representing ladies wore no hats. The others were excusable for keeping their hats on. 2 flutes, 2 violins, 2 guitars furnished the music. Our party again increased in numbers, and we went to the new brigade headquarters, not yet occupied as such, where we had 3 rooms. Dancing was kept up until nearly midnight, and a tempting lunch provided us before retiring. We rose at reveille, and during breakfast, after much begging and pleading, we were furnished with our first glimpse of hardtack. It did not, however, form part of the meal, but was converted into autograph albums, and the writer of this article knows of the piece, which is still in existence. A fragment, too, of the 4th Ohio battle flag, which was considerate enough to be blown off while on review at that time, is dearly cherished memento of that interesting occasion. So there we go. We have another account of a event that will happen, and we're again more in winter quarters, right? If you're off a campaign season, you have to make up the time. Sometimes you're going to have these events, these balls, or invite civilians to. Grand reviews also happen. The Confederates also did that famously as well. And to close out, we'll talk about music, and this is actually coming from Private John Billings, and he's in the 10th Massachusetts Light Artillery. He does write his famous Hardtack and Coffee, and that describes a lot of soldier life, and we talked about it here in a few episodes past when we were mentioning memoirs that were of particular interest that we've done in the Patreon. But here we go. John Billings talking about music we've talked about before as being very important. In some tents, vocal or instrumental music was a feature of the evening. There is probably not a regiment in the service that did not boast at least one violinist, one banjoist, and a bone player in the ranks, not to mention other instruments generally found associated with these. And one of all of them could be heard in operation, either inside or in a company street, most any pleasant evening. However unskillful the artist they were sure to be center of an interested audience. The usual medley of comic songs and Negro melodies comprised the great part of the entertainment, and if the space admitted, a jig or clog dance was stepped up on a hardtack box or other crude platform. And this is in Billings terms here. Sometimes a real Negro is brought in to enliven the occasion by patting and dancing juba or singing his quaint music. There was always plenty of them in or near camp, ready to fill any gap. For they asked nothing better than to be with Massa Lincoln's soldiers. But the men played tricks of all descriptions on them, descending at times to most shameful abuse until somebody interfered. So there we have an interesting depiction of that. Obviously negative there at the end. We're talking about these individuals who are coming in, formerly enslaved individuals coming into camp, and we know we've highlighted that before, how they're not always welcomed by every soldier, but music, very important, right? You're trying to pass the time. It's one of the things that you're going to do to pass the time is listen to and play music. So there, I think we can wrap it up for today. We've actually done a pretty good job of covering a lot of different areas of soldiers' life, so hopefully you found these accounts interesting. We also talked about Francis Preston Blair Sr. and the peace overtures that are going to be happening fairly soon. Next week, we're going to head to North Carolina. We need to carry out one last sport of the Confederacy with the assault and capture of Fort Fisher. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.